She quietly handed the old man another book, letting him stay long past closing time. Her supervisor didn't raise his voice, didn't even seem angry, just cold and final. "You're done here, Margaret. 22 years of service ends today." One act of kindness, erased in a single sentence. She didn't argue, just gathered her things with trembling hands and walked out. Not because she broke protocol, but because she refused to throw out an 82-year-old veteran who had nowhere else to go. What Margaret didn't know was that someone had been watching, and before the evening news aired, the ground began to shake. 3 black SUVs pulled into the library parking lot, and out stepped a Navy SEAL commander in full dress uniform, a man who owed his life to the very veteran she protected. In that moment, everything changed. Welcome to Veteran Story Life, where we honor the quiet heroes who stand up for those who served. Before we dive into this powerful story of respect, loyalty, and unexpected justice, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that kindness should never be punished, hit that subscribe button, because these stories remind us what truly matters. Margaret Sullivan had worked at the Riverside Public Library for 22 years. At 58, she wasn't the head librarian, just the evening supervisor who made sure the lights went out and the doors were locked. But to the regulars, especially the older ones, she was something more precious. She was someone who cared. The library sat on the edge of downtown, a solid brick building that had weathered decades of budget cuts and changing times. Most evenings were quiet, filled with the soft sound of turning pages and the occasional whisper. But Margaret noticed things others didn't. She saw the veterans who came not just for books, but for warmth, for silence, for a place where nobody asked questions about why their hands sometimes shook, or why they chose the table farthest from the door. Harold Peterson was one of them. 82 years old, with silver hair always combed neat and clothes that were clean but worn thin. He'd served in Korea, though he never talked about it. Every evening at 5:30, Harold would shuffle through the front doors, nod politely to Margaret, and settle into the same chair by the biography section. He'd read for exactly 2 hours, then quietly check out one book and head home to an empty apartment 6 blocks away. Margaret knew his routine because she made it her business to know. Harold's wife had passed 3 years earlier. His son lived in California, called twice a month if Harold was lucky. Most nights, the library was the only human contact he had all day. She also knew that on Thursday evenings, Harold sometimes stayed a little longer, not because he was reading, but because going home to silence felt harder on Thursdays for reasons he'd never explained. That's why, when closing time came and Harold was still sitting quietly in his chair, Margaret would sometimes find small tasks to keep herself busy. Straightening shelves that didn't need straightening, organizing returns that could wait until tomorrow, giving Harold an extra 20 minutes of warmth and light before sending him back into the dark. She never thought of it as breaking rules. She thought of it as being human. But David Chen, the new assistant director, saw things differently. At 35, David had come to Riverside with an MBA, efficiency charts, and strong opinions about operational optimization. He'd been hired 6 months earlier with a mandate to modernize systems and reduce costs. To David, every minute past closing time was wasted payroll. Every exception was a policy violation waiting to create liability. He'd noticed Margaret's flexibility with closing procedures. He'd seen her let patrons finish chapters, help elderly visitors find books even when the lights were dimming, and occasionally, like tonight, allow someone to linger past the official closing hour. David had been watching from his office window when Harold Peterson missed the 8 p.m. announcement. He'd seen Margaret approach the old man's table, see her speak quietly to him, and then instead of asking him to leave, she docked back to the circulation desk and continued working. By 8:20, the library should have been empty and locked. Instead, Harold sat reading, while Margaret organized book returns she could have left until morning. David checked his watch, then picked up his phone and made a call. "Regional office? This is Chen at Riverside. I need to report a policy violation." 20 minutes later, Sharon Whitfield, the regional library director, walked through the front doors with David close behind. She was a woman who ran libraries like businesses, And tonight, she looked like she meant business. Margaret looked up from the circulation desk, surprised. "Sharon, what brings you here so late?" "A policy violation," Sharon said crisply, gesturing toward Harold, who had looked up from his book with confused, worried eyes. "The library closed at 8 o'clock. That patron should have been asked to leave." Margaret's stomach dropped. "He's just finishing a chapter. I was about to." "You were about to what? Ignore operating procedures for the sake of personal feelings?" Sharon's voice carried across the quiet library, making Harold shift uncomfortably in his chair. "He's an elderly veteran," Margaret said quietly. "He has nowhere else to go." "That's not our responsibility," David interjected. "Library policy is clear. Closing time means closing time." Sharon nodded. "Margaret, you've been warned about this before. Your emotional attachments to certain patrons are affecting your professional judgment." Across the library, Harold slowly closed his book and began gathering his things, his movements careful and dignified despite the obvious embarrassment. Margaret watched him and felt something break inside her chest. "His name is Harold Peterson," she said, her voice steady but strained. "He served in Korea. He lost his wife 3 years ago. This library is the only place he has left where he feels human." "I don't care if he's a general," Sharon replied coldly. "Rules exist for a reason. Liability, security, proper resource management. You've let your personal feelings compromise your professional responsibilities for the last time." Harold had reached the front door, moving slowly, his head down. He paused and looked back at Margaret. Their eyes met across the library, and in that moment, she made a choice. "Then I guess you'll have to fire me," Margaret said quietly, "because I refuse to treat a man who served this country like he's invisible just because a clock says it's convenient." Sharon's expression hardened. "Fine. Margaret Sullivan, you're terminated, effective immediately. 22 years of employment ends tonight. David, please escort her out and collect her keys." The library fell into complete silence. Harold had stopped at the door, his hand on the handle, listening to the woman who had shown him kindness be punished for that kindness. Margaret didn't cry. She gathered her purse, pulled her car keys from her pocket, and removed the library key from the ring. As she handed it to David, she looked at Harold one more time. "The biography section gets new books every Tuesday," she said loud enough for him to hear. "Someone else will help you find them." Harold nodded once, opened the door, and disappeared into the night. Margaret followed, walking past Sharon and David without another word, leaving 22 years of her life behind for the sake of one old man's dignity. What none of them knew was that Harold Peterson wasn't just any veteran, and what they definitely didn't know was that someone had been watching the whole confrontation through the library's front windows. Across the street, in a parked sedan, Commander James Rodriguez of the U.S. Navy SEALs had been waiting for Harold to come out. Harold was his grandfather, not by blood, but by bond. Harold had served with James's grandfather in Korea, had carried him to safety when shrapnel tore through his leg, had visited every holiday for 60 years until James's grandfather passed away 2 years earlier. James had been taking care of Harold ever since, quietly, the way Harold had once taken care of his family. He'd followed Harold to the library tonight because the old man had seemed more fragile lately, more lost. James wanted to make sure he got home safely. Instead, he'd watched through the window as an old soldier was humiliated and a kind woman was fired for the crime of human decency. Commander Rodriguez pulled out his phone and made a series of calls, short, clipped conversations with people who owed him favors, who respected his judgment, who understood that some debts could never be fully repaid. 30 minutes later, 3 black SUVs pulled into the library parking lot. Sharon and David were still inside, discussing transition protocols and policy enforcement, when the building's lights flickered. Then they heard the footsteps. Heavy, synchronized, unmistakable. The front doors opened, and Commander James Rodriguez entered, followed by 6 Navy SEALs in full dress uniforms. Their ribbons caught the fluorescent light, their bearing was parade ground perfect, and their presence filled the library like a storm front. Sharon looked up from her paperwork, her face pale. David stepped back instinctively, suddenly feeling very small. "I'm Commander Rodriguez, U.S. Navy," James said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stand straighter without thinking about it. "I understand you just fired someone for showing kindness to an 82-year-old Korean War veteran." Sharon swallowed hard. "Sir, this is a library matter. Personnel decisions are—" "Harold Peterson," Commander Rodriguez continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "served 2 tours in Korea. He was awarded 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He saved 12 American lives, including my grandfather's, during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge." David tried to speak up. "Commander, I'm sure you understand that policies exist for—" One of the seals behind Rodriguez shifted slightly, and David's words died in his throat. "That man," Rodriguez continued, "comes to this library because it's the only place left where he feels like his life has meaning. And you just humiliated him in front of the woman who made that possible." Sharon's voice shook slightly. "We had no way of knowing his background. You had no way of knowing because you didn't care enough to ask." Rodriguez's tone didn't rise, but somehow it got hard. "Harold Peterson doesn't talk about his service because men of his generation were taught that heroes don't brag. But Margaret Sullivan saw what you couldn't. She saw a human being who deserved respect." The library was dead silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. "Where is she now?" Rodriguez asked. She was terminated," Sharon stammered. "She violated library policy." "She upheld something more important than library policy," Rodriguez interrupted. "She upheld the promise this country made to every person who served it, the promise that their sacrifice would be remembered, honored, and protected." He pulled out his phone and made a call. Everyone in the library could hear his voice carry through the silence. "Mayor's office? This is Commander Rodriguez. I need to speak to Mayor Thompson immediately. It's about the Riverside Library and how they're treating our veterans." Sharon's face went white. The mayor was up for re-election, and military support was crucial in their district. Rodriguez ended the call and turned back to Sharon. "You have a choice. You can reinstate Margaret Sullivan immediately, with a full apology and recognition for her service to this community. Or you can explain to the mayor, the city council, and every veterans organization in this county why you fired someone for treating a war hero with dignity." Before Sharon could respond, Rodriguez's phone buzzed. He answered it, listened for a moment, then smiled grimly. "That was the mayor," he said. "Apparently, your regional office just received some calls from the American Legion, the VFW, the Korean War Veterans Association, and about 40 other organizations that suddenly became very interested in how the Riverside Library treats its veterans." David looked like he might faint. Sharon's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. "I'll call Margaret immediately," she said quickly. "This has all been a misunderstanding." "No," Rodriguez said firmly. "This has been a choice, and now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. But this story isn't really about consequences. It's about what happened next." For 30 minutes the library stood silent. Sharon and David sat in uncomfortable quiet, processing what had just happened, neither quite sure how to navigate the storm they'd created. Then Margaret's phone rang. She was sitting in her car outside her apartment, still numb from losing 22 years of her life when she heard Mayor Thompson's voice on the line. "Margaret, this is Mayor Thompson. I understand there's been a situation at the library. I'm calling to offer you something better than your old job back. I'm offering you the position of Director of Community Veteran Services, a brand new department with a budget and a mission to serve our veterans the way they deserve to be served." Harold Peterson never fully understood what had happened that night. But when he returned to the library the next evening, Margaret was there waiting for him with a cup of coffee and his favorite chair reserved in what was now called the Veterans Reading Corner. Spread quickly through the veteran community that Riverside Library had become something different, something special. What had started as a place to check out books had become a sanctuary for those who served job placement assistance, benefit navigation, quiet spaces for those who needed them. Always, always, a place where time moved at the pace of human dignity. Margaret threw herself into the work with the same quiet intensity she'd always brought to her job. She partnered with the VA, connected veterans with resources, and most importantly, made sure that every person who walked through those doors knew they mattered. But the real change happened in the smaller moments. David Chen found himself reassigned to a different library system entirely. His MBA and efficiency charts hadn't prepared him for the reality that treating people with dignity was actually the most efficient way to run a public service. Sharon Whitfield announced her early retirement, citing a desire to spend more time with family. Though everyone knew the real reason, Commander Rodriguez kept his promise to check on Harold regularly, but now he knew the old man was in the best possible hands, surrounded by people who understood that respect wasn't something you had to earn, it was something you deserved simply by being human. The transformation of Riverside Library became a model studied by library systems across the country. But for Margaret, it was never about recognition or awards. It was about the quiet moments. The elderly veteran who hadn't spoken to another person in days, finding someone who would listen, the young soldier's wife discovering resources to help her navigate military benefits, the older veteran like Harold, who simply needed a place to feel human again. 6 months after that confrontation, Margaret received an official commendation from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, recognizing her innovative approach to community veteran services. The ceremony was small, held right there in the library. Harold Peterson sat in the front row wearing his Korean War veteran cap for the first time in decades, his eyes bright with something that looked very much like pride. When Margaret was asked to speak, she kept her remarks simple. "I didn't set out to change anything," she said. "I just refused to treat a human being like an inconvenience." Harold Peterson lived 2 more years, years filled with daily visits to the library, afternoon conversations with other veterans, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he belonged somewhere. His funeral was attended by more people than anyone expected. Veterans who had heard his story, library patrons who had been inspired by his dignity, and Navy SEALs who understood that some debts can never be fully repaid but must always be honored. Margaret spoke at his service. She talked about quiet courage, about a man who had served his country with honor and then spent his later years teaching others about the power of simple human decency. She talked about the night she almost lost her job for letting him stay 20 minutes past closing time, and how those 20 minutes had changed everything. Today, the Riverside Public Library's Veterans section bears a small bronze plaque in memory of Harold Peterson, Korean War veteran, and all who served quietly. Next to it is a comfortable leather chair that's always reserved for any veteran who needs a place to sit, read, and remember that they are valued, that their service matters, and that they are seen. Margaret still works there, though now as director of a program that serves hundreds of veterans across 3 counties. She still notices the elderly patrons who move slowly, the young veterans who choose tables near the back, the family members who need resources they didn't know existed. And she still believes that kindness should never be negotiable, that dignity should never be conditional, and that sometimes the most important stand you can take is refusing to let another human being feel invisible. But Margaret's story isn't just about one librarian or one veteran. It's about the choice we all make every day. The choice between efficiency and empathy, between policy and compassion, between seeing people as problems to be managed or as human beings deserving of respect. Harold Peterson had served his country in Korea, had earned medals and recognition that he never talked about. He had loved a woman for 50 years, raised children, contributed to his community, and his final years found himself alone and overlooked by a world that had forgotten what he had given. What he needed wasn't charity or pity. He needed exactly what Margaret gave him: recognition that his life had value, that his presence mattered, that he belonged. The confrontation that night wasn't really about library policy or closing times. It was about something much deeper, about how we treat the most vulnerable among us, about whether we see rules as tools to serve people or barriers to keep them away, about whether we remember that behind every regulation, every procedure, every efficiency measure are human beings with stories worth hearing. Margaret Sullivan made a choice that night. She chose dignity over policy, humanity over procedure, and in doing so, She reminded everyone watching that the true measure of a community isn't how efficiently it operates, but how it treats those who need it most in a world that moves faster every day. It's easy to forget that behind every statistic, every policy, every procedure are people, real people, with histories and hopes and the fundamental need to be treated with dignity. Margaret remembered that, and it cost her a job she loved, but what she gained was immeasurable. The knowledge that she had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. How many Harold Petersons have we walked past without seeing? How many opportunities have we missed to show kindness to those who served? How many times have we chosen convenience over compassion, over empathy? Margaret's story reminds us that heroism isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as letting someone stay past closing time, as simple as seeing another person's humanity, as powerful as refusing to let someone feel invisible. We want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for a veteran? Have you been in a situation where you had to choose between following rules and doing what was right? Have you ever been the Harold Peterson in someone else's story? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to choose kindness when it matters most. Thank you for watching Veteran Story Life. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in treating our veterans with the honor they deserve. Because sometimes the strongest stand doesn't come with a uniform. It comes from the heart. Remember, respect for those who served should never be conditional on convenience. Every veteran deserves to be seen, heard, and valued, not just on holidays, but every single day, because at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to make it through. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is make sure nobody has to make it through alone. Until next time, keep honoring the quiet heroes among us, and remember that kindness is never wasted, dignity is never negotiable, and sometimes 20 minutes past closing time can change the world.